doing a French polish on a piece of furniture or a tabletop or whatever. And now I think also the requirements in the marketplace for a certain sophistication of surface indicate something other than perhaps the traditional French polish. You know, you'll see somebody, you know, oh, it only took me a day to French polish my guitar, and again, they have a picture on the internet of a shiny guitar-like object. And it may be wonderful that what they've done in that day, but you can't tell from the photograph. You can really only tell how sophisticated and well done the surface is from So all right, let's start. I'm David LaPlante. I only became really a professional guitar maker, and I hardly even want to, I'm hesitant to call myself a professional guitar maker because I'm retired from another thing that I did for 35 years. But I've been building guitars for 50 years and French polishing them for probably around 35 of that 50 years. I've made a lot of steel string guitars and really enjoy those. I've had several periods during my guitar making career that I've concentrated on classical guitars, and perhaps the last 10 years I've concentrated on them more than before, although I feel myself drifting back into maybe steel string guitars a little bit too. But the French polish was basically, I started doing it probably around 1979 as I was producing classical guitars for sale, obviously, and needed a simple way to finish them, and I felt that the French polish was considered a plus in the marketplace, at least by the classical guitar players, because it's a very thin finish, and people believe that guitars with French polish would sound better than perhaps guitars with a thicker finish, which is very debatable, but I didn't care about that much. I just knew that this was the perception of the classical guitar buyers. So, you know, how sometimes you'd rather sell an instrument than not, and if you have to make a concession to somebody's conceived notions, sometimes it's not. It's easy enough to do it. Now, I asked before, how many of you folks are presently using French polish in some form or other? All right, so we've got some good experience here, and then the rest of you, I'm assuming, are pretty much starting out. Well, the place to start is shellac. French polish is not anything other than, it's really a description of producing a finish with shellac by hand using a pad. And so basically we got shellac. My preferences for shellac, I buy most of my shellac from LMI. Anybody from LMI here? Okay. I have no stake in LMI, but LMI they offer 5 different color grades of shellac, from blonde through like a very dark sort of garnet shellac, and this is their number 3 shellac. This is sort of middle of the road, pretty much quite amber. What I've noticed is that the lighter shellacs seem to not dry as hard as the darker shellacs. But the darker shellacs take, I think, a bit more skill and application. Most of the guitars I make have light German spruce tops, so you have to be careful with going darker with the shellac in terms of getting an even application. So it's easy to end up with a little bit of a blotchy look if you're not doing an even application. So if you're just starting out, you know, maybe the number 1 or 2 is a good choice. Don't stay away from the number 3 and number 4 until you've got your technique down. But I do think the darker shellacs give you a little bit more durable finish, less prone to imprinting. Although if you've got a shellac, a French polished guitar, and it's a hot day and you've got it against your sweaty body, it may be warm enough and moist enough to imprint. So But I think the technique that I use that uses no oil helps with the surface. And actually, I have to say I haven't really had any complaints from anybody about that problem since I've stopped using oil. So as I say, the typical regimen for French polishing usually includes some oil to help lubricate the pad. And I don't use oil, and I'll illustrate how I get around that. And I know, has anyone had problems? Somebody mentioned problems with oil. Milkiness and
got some cloudiness.
Cloudiness, and although that could just be moisture in your finish too, being captured. But eliminating the oil, I think, eliminates a lot of the guesswork. Somebody hand me, can you grab me? I didn't take it for myself yet. All right. So let's just go through this really quickly for the people who are just starting out in terms of what to buy to get going with French polish. So obviously we talked about shellac flake. Lots of places to buy this. I like LMI because I think they offer pretty consistent product. It's de-waxed, which is good. The thing I've noticed though is that since shellac, and there's a few videos on YouTube that show how shellac is produced, and it's quite fascinating. But because shellac is a totally natural product, even the gradations of LMI, every time I buy like number 3, it's a little different from the last number 3 I had. It might be a slightly different color cast, maybe a little greener, a little bit yellower, or a little redder, you know, so that it varies. Being a natural product, I think they take what they get and they grade it, you know, as close as they can to their parameters. So don't necessarily expect to get exactly the same thing you got before when you buy shellac, because it's a natural product, and I think wherever it comes from or whatever supply that they have currently.
Do you prefer de-wax?
I buy the de-wax. I think I've used both and didn't really notice much difference.
Okay.
You know, some people use de-wax, some people use the raw. I guess it's raw.
Hey, can you store that for any amount of time on mixed in on the flake?
Yeah, I was going to say the material that I used on this preliminarily is a year old, and I just mixed up a new batch here from this material. But yeah, it seems to last pretty well. I have bottles of shellac that are 5 and 6 years old that still seem to dry without a problem. So the lighter, blonder shellacs seem to be more prone to moisture problems. In other words, the alcohol solvent will pull moisture out of the air and cause problems with the shellac drying. So if you have if your shellac isn't drying quickly, you may have old shellac. You know, I think it can affect. I had a quantity of blonde shellac, and it all sort of stuck together, and I think it was moisture, and so I decided not to use it. But once you mix it, it will pull moisture out of the air. So it's always good to start with fresh material. But as I say, I've kept and used. I usually use a quantity of shellac. I'll use this for the next year, and I don't anticipate any problems at all.
There's no shelf life for the flakes themselves.
The flakes, I think, do have a shelf life, but I haven't. But I've never. I usually use them well before, so I couldn't really tell you what it would be.
Is there any way to do like a pre-test on your shellac so you can make sure it's going to dry without a problem?
Yeah, I mean, mix it up and then
Is glass.
apply it on something, yeah, and see how well it dries, see how quickly it dries. Because it's important that it dries hard over a short period of time so that you can continue to work. But it's also important that it dries hard within the short term, because it's important in the application. If you've got shellac that isn't drying at all, you've got a gummy mess. It's not what I'm going to show you won't work.
So how long do you let that test piece sit?
Should dry hard overnight, unless you pool it on something. If it's a fairly thin, layer, it should dry. So all right, so we got shellac flakes, alcohol. There's a lot of people use different kinds of alcohol. Somebody was talking about Everclear, which is like 190 proof ethanol that you buy at the liquor store. Whatever state you live in, it's going to vary. This is denatured ethanol. I bought it at the hardware stores. And there is a little bit of methanol in this, I think maybe 5%. So I guess health warning, don't bathe in it and use it in a well-ventilated area. But I think 5% methanol is not too injurious. I'm still here.
And don't use 150 Everclear.
Because it's got too much moisture in it.
Too much moisture.
Right. Yeah, you got to use the. I think
made that mistake once.
in chemistry class they taught me something about there's no such thing as 200 proof because it will immediately pull moisture out of the air. So the highest you can get is like 190 or 195 because it's invariably going to pull moisture out of the air and not be 200 proof. So at any rate, basic alcohol, ethanol, and now I write plastic here in caps. Plastic containers, both for your shellac and your pad. If you use a glass jar, like a mason jar, it will quickly weld itself shut, and then you will have to try to get it open, and if you have an accident, you'll be in the emergency room instead of polishing guitars.
This little trick on welding the top shut, if you put 2 layers of plastic and then cap it shut,
Right.
it'll never weld.
Like saran wrap, that sort of thing?
No, I wouldn't use saran wrap. I'd use heavier plastic. I use candy bags.
Okay.
Heavy plastic, but I
Well,
put 2 layers down, tighten it up, and I've never had it stick.
here's a Rubbermaid container I bought at the local Hannaford food market for $3 or $4. And it's got a wide mouth, and it's easy to pour the flakes in, and then it's easy to access with this pop lid top. So I haven't found anything better to keep shellac in.
Seals up well enough?
Huh?
Does it seal up well enough?
Yeah, it does. It's I mean, you can tape it if you want, that sort
I
of
mean, a
thing.
little pop top thing.
It seals very well. These are very precisely made, so I've never had any indication that it didn't. I mean, I wouldn't like tip it over and hold it upside down. It might.
Yeah.
But and basically, to mix the shellac, I start out with a consistent cut. And the way I get that consistent cut, people have heard about 2-pound cut or whatever the heck that means. What I simply do is to take the shellac flakes and I pour them into this so that, whatever amount I want to mix. And then I simply cover them with the methanol. Pour enough methanol in there to cover the flakes, maybe just a little bit over. So, and then agitate it periodically for 24 hours, just until it dissolves. What you end up with, you can see here, you see there's a little sludge in the bottom of that? There's still some undissolved shellac at the bottom. What that means is that this is now a supersaturated solution. There's as much shellac as will go into that alcohol. So I start out with a supersaturated solution. You don't have to measure. You just, as long as you don't put too much alcohol in there, you'll have a supersaturated solution, and the key to it is seeing if you still have some left on the bottom. And then I let it sit and just let whatever, because it's a natural product, there may be little bits of God only knows what in there. So I just allow it to settle and then basically decant what I need off the top. So don't be shaking the bottle once you get it, dissolved, just let it sit. And, when you need just pour some off the top. So this is useful in that you always end up starting at with the same viscosity. And you want to control the viscosity for a number of reasons, mostly to help you move the pad and the regimen that I have, you sort of decrease the viscosity of the shellac as you move through the process. So this gives you a starting point that's consistent, and you'll get a feel for it. And there's no, it's just very simple to do. You also need a container for your pad. The pad, I just call it a pad. Some people call it a fad, some people call it a rubber, some people call it, the Spanish call it a muñeca. I just call it a pad. And you need to keep it in a container where you can keep it moist. I mean, you can let it dry out, but it's not really necessary. I usually try to keep it in a container. This is a container that I got. It comes with Truvia sweetener. It's a plant-based artificial sweetener. Well, it's not really artificial. It's a natural sweetener, and it's got a wide pop top. It's just the right size and shape. It's got a nice pop top lid, so you can buy this and dump the Truvia out or use it for your coffee in the morning, which I do. And I found this is like the perfect thing. I used to use one of my wife's cold cream jars, sort of the round, short, squatty jars. But even though they were plastic, they would also kind of weld themselves shut every so often. So this pop top lid seals pretty well because it does have shellac sort of coated on it. But I found this to be really handy. So you can experiment, use whatever works for it. Again, I don't like glass because it's sort of dangerous. Yeah.
I'm trying to picture dealing with pulling the head out of the wet
Yes.
and then using it.
Well, I'll show you how I work that.
Because I try to keep mine in a wet environment, but not actually wet.
Right. Well, I usually keep it, I never have have it totally immersed. It does get rather wet and soaked, but I do things to it before I actually start using it, which I'll show you when I get to that point. 3M Gold Free Cut paper is my favorite paper. Now this is where I deviate from the traditional French polish method. I'm sanding between my applications to level and refine the surface. Again, there are ways of leveling the surface, or at least attempting to level the surface in traditional French polishing. But most of the guitar makers that I know, now I'm saying guitar makers, most of the guitar makers I know that are achieving a really sophisticated finish with French polish are sanding. So I used to do lacquer finishing, and this is the technique that I brought over from lacquer. So any of you who do lacquer finishing know all about sanding in between applications. So I'm doing something similar with the French polish too.
What grit do you use?
Well, it varies on the process. The grits, again, go from heavier to lighter. I'm tending now to use mostly 600 and 800 paper because I'm tending to work thinner and leave off while I have a bit more smoother surface. So 600 and 800 is about as heavy as I need to go. Some of you, if you body up with a thicker shellac mixture, you may want to go back as far as maybe even 320. But I find that it all leaves scratches, and the polish is thin, so I try not to leave scratches any more prominent than I can easily fill with successive polishing. So it varies. I mean, I'll be demonstrating some of the sanding tomorrow, and I'll probably go with the 800 paper because I've developed the surface on these demonstration pieces to the point where I think I'm at that point. So I like the free cut paper because it's lubricated, so it doesn't load up too badly, although it loads up pretty quick. But it has sort of a lubricant on it. I think it's stearated, and it's got a nice feel. It doesn't skid across the surface. It's sort of, it's lubricated, so it's sort of smooth and satisfying to sand with it as opposed to the regular wet dry paper, which I don't use anymore. Pad covers. We were just talking with a gentleman here I like this material, which I guess is still available, but I think they've stopped making you have to order it on Amazon. These are Wonder Rags. It's a microfiber cloth. I know that some people have recommended muslin or cotton bed sheets. I used to use the a t-shirt, well-worn t-shirt material. But surprisingly, a raw wood guitar surface is pretty abrasive, so you can wear a hole through some of that cotton material really easily. And this Wonder Rag material is a microfiber cloth, and it's very smooth, so it's nice, and it's also, it wears really, really well. I'll get maybe 6-8 months a year out of a pad cover. So I'm gonna, here, pass this around, you can, and I want it back, because I've got limited supply of that stuff.
I've just done this before.
Yeah,
It holds up better than cotton.
yeah, they all work. They all work. I just found this Wonder Rag to be really great. And it's just filled with a raw cotton fiber film. Raw cotton, the cotton that still has the little brown bits in it and that kind of stuff. That's what I've changed the pad cover on this umpteen zillion times, but the core of it is probably 20 years old. It's that cotton wad that I've been using for years, and it's really compressed at this point. So it's very firm, and that's what you want. You don't want it sort of squishy. You want it really firm.
Where do you get the raw fiber? I tried to find it.
I forget where I got this. It was some packing material, or I used to work for a museum where they had all sorts of old arcane materials, and I think maybe I got it from there. I don't even remember. It's so long ago. I mean, you can use, like medicinal cotton, but it's kind of bouncy, and so whatever you want it to be really well compressed so it's firm. Yeah.
I've been using lamb's wool from the drugstore.
Oh, all right. That's interesting. Sure. I think the main thing is to have a pad that's, as they say, firm, not soft and squishy.
Using what from the drugstore?
Lamb's wool.
Land, what?
Lamb's wool?
Oh, lamb's wool.
Yeah. Okay. Now for polishing, I like McGuire's, available at your local automobile store. For final buffing, I like the 85 diamond cut, which is, by the time I'm done with developing the surface, usually that on one of the StuMax buffing wheels will bring it right up to a nice shine. And if I want to get a little bit more sophisticated with it, I'll use the McGuire's number 2 fine and the number 7 glaze. And anybody here uses McGuire's stuff for polishing? Yeah. So the nice thing about McGuire's, it's repaintable. So if you polish a guitar with McGuire's and you kind of don't like the way it came out, and you're seeing some areas that you want to refine, you can touch them up with a little micro mesh or a little bit of 800, and then repolish. You can add a little French polish over it. It's recoatable, so it's one of the reasons I like the McGuire's. There's nothing in it that'll interfere with subsequent coats and finish if you want to add more over it. So, and it's easy. You can buy it locally. Most auto supply stores will have this stuff. And then the foam. All right, so preparation. This guitar is a body that I got from Martin, thanks to Gail at Guitar Maker, so I could use it as a demo. And I prepped it using a Martin neck that I fitted to the body. This is a bolt-on neck, so it's pretty easy. I just put the bolt through with the insert. But I also added like a sheetrock screw through this and into, but not through, the end block to catch it at that. So this is as rigid as like an actual neck, and I'll be I'm handling it using this handle, and I had a few extras, so a couple of you got those. So if you're working on a guitar that already has the neck attached, then so much the better. You're going to handle it by the neck, and there's a little difference in the sequencing of polishing which surfaces, so I'll talk about that in a moment. But basically, in general, this is mahogany, so it's a little different than, I'm usually finishing rosewood, maple, cypress, spruce. I don't build guitars out of mahogany usually. So this is a little different in that it was mahogany, but I figured it's apropos for a lot of the things I'm sure you're making. So sanded to about 100 grit, filled with, again, I don't own stock in LMI, but I like the LMI micro bead filler. This is I think it's anybody use this already, micro bead? It's a paste filler. I think it's an acrylic. It's got the micro bead, to thicken it, and it's also got, colorant. It's sort of a typical walnut filler color. And I apply this over the wood, sanded to about 100, 120, with a credit card. Brush it on and then scrape it off against the grain, across the grain, using a credit card. And then come along with maybe 120 again and sand it, or even 150, and just sand it right back to the wood. So you've left the pores, left the filler in the pores as much as any filler sticks in the wood. Yeah, fair.
You use Pour Pack, same thing?
What's that?
The more traditional.
Well, no. I have used Poropack. Here's the difference. The traditional Silex Poropack filler does not sand clean off wood bindings and purflings. The reason I use this LMI is that for a lot of the guitars that I French polish, have wood bindings, wood purflings, and wood rosette. So the traditional filler, like what Martin uses under their lacquer, will stain all that stuff, and whether or not you can sand it clean is problematic. This material just sits on top of the wood, and you can sand it. It sands clean, so it's the main reason I use it. I'm not saying if you've got a guitar that if you're normally using Poropack filler and you've got a guitar with plastic bindings where you can scrape them clean, which I'm sure you're used to doing, I don't see any reason why you can't use that filler under the shellac, under the French polish. But there's no reason. There's no reason, I don't think, why you can't use it for that purpose. I don't use it because it's not. It doesn't work well for the sorts of guitars that I'm making. So that's why I use this, and that's what I used on this. And so this gets sanded back to 150, 180, and then you're ready for what we call the spit coat. And this guitar has had obviously I started with a spit coat over the entire guitar, and the spit coat is just a very rather wet, thinned out coat of shellac applied with the pad, and it's wet enough so that you're not concerned about the surface at all. You just want to make sure it soaks into the wood as far as it wants to. So you don't want to be too sloppy with it, so you're dripping it all over the place. But you want to just give it a generous spit coat so that you get as much shellac absorbed into the wood as it will take reasonably. Because it's important to get it even, because if you were sparing with it and you didn't get it soaked in properly, you might end up with an area that would look different under the fin once you get finished with it. So I give the body an entire spit coat. Now, in terms of some of the, getting back to the wood bindings and purflings, for a guitar like this, I didn't bother with it because there was nothing to bleed into anything else. But if you're making a guitar, if you have a guitar, for instance, made from Indian rosewood with maple bindings, and you put a spit coat of shellac, which is mostly alcohol on that, you're going to have your wood bleed into those, you're going to have a purple bindings by the time you're done, or lavender bindings.
I just did that.
Huh? It's fun, isn't it?
Ask you that question.
Yeah. This is a problem. I mean, alcohol pretty much dissolves most of the colors that are incorporated into various wood species. So the way I avoid that is to use what's called an egg wash. And I learned this from the Spanish guitar makers. What they do is they take, and it's very simple again, you take 3 or 4 eggs, and I just use the egg whites. And you know, if you crack an egg open, you're going to have a very liquid white that will flow out of it, and then there's a more gelatinous egg white. What I use is just that very clear, very liquid portion of the egg white that will flow out of the egg when you crack it, not the gelatinous white, but the very liquid one. So maybe 4 or 5 eggs will give you half a cup full of that very nice clear liquid. And that's simply brushed over the entire guitar. It's protein. So what it does, you brush that over the entire guitar, it seals up, it seals the wood, it seals that surface, gives a barrier so that when you put that spit coat on, it doesn't bleed. It's a very, and you'll just apply it to the entire guitar and the entire neck, let it dry overnight, and then you're ready to go. It'll give it a little bit of a dried, sort of maybe slightly roughened surface. You can scuff it a little bit, but it's not. You should raise the grain before you apply it. You know, like you would during your sanding. You know, presumably you've already raised the grain. You know, on the top and the back within your sanding procedure. Yes.
Have you ever sized the wood rather than the egg wash with hide glue?
I haven't, but that might work.
Just an idea.
What you need is something that's going to form a barrier.
Barrier between the alcohol and the dye.
Yeah, and the color in the wood. So the egg wash is something that I use on all the classical guitars I make because they all combine rosewoods and holly and various dark woods against the various light woods. And I don't want the dark woods bleeding into the light woods. So
How long do you leave that egg wash?
24 hours. Let it dry overnight.
You want to wipe it clean though? I mean, you don't want.
I just brush it on. And one thing you want to be careful of, if you do have a little bit of the gelatinous egg white, I use it like a soft sable artist brush to brush it on. And don't get frothy with it. Don't, get too active with it, because if you'll end up sort of whipping those egg whites up a little bit, and you can end up with sort of a little bit of it'll change the reflectivity of the finish under the shellac. So just put it on as smoothly and as passively as you can, and it'll dry, form a nice barrier, so that when you do put that very wet spit coat on, you'll have a clean result. So I didn't do it on this guitar because there's nothing to bleed in anything else, but it's a very useful technique. Yeah.
How do you cleanly separate the liquid portion of the egg whites from everything else?
I just sort of crack the thing and hold it, try to keep the yolk and the more gelatinous part of the white, trapped with my fingers, and just sort of let that really liquid portion flow out of it.
So some of it gets in there, it's not the end of the world.
Yes, yeah, you can pick it out, or as long as you don't, and you can sort of select, if you're dipping your brush in it, you can sort of avoid it and just get the smoother material on the brush. But yeah, it's certainly not the end of the world. But I found the first one that I did, I got a little bit too active with the brushing, and I ended up with some strange, certain areas of the guitar didn't have the same clarity and reflectivity in a very subtle way as the other ones did, and then I realized it was my egg wash that I got a little bit too brushy with. So, yes?
You just unlocked my brain with the egg white. You put a little silver nitrate in there. You could contact print a photograph on it.
All right. Albumin, right? An albumin. Yeah. So yeah, it's just protein. So and you can take the yolk and the rest of it and make your breakfast with it if you want. So, all right. So where are we now? So we've sanded, we've filled, we put the egg wash on, and now we've put the spit coat on. All right. So we're pretty much ready to start what I'm calling the bodying sequences, or the bodying regimen. And I have a bodying regimen. I don't try to French polish the entire guitar at once, because from a practical standpoint, you need something to hold on to. You need a place to set it down without it being sticky, whatever. So, depending upon whether or not I have the neck on or whether or not it's separate neck and body, which is what I've got here, and probably, as I said, who's anybody here building classical guitars in the Spanish style? Okay, so we'll talk about that. I mean, it's pretty much the same as what I'm doing. So most everybody else is doing some sort of separate body neck construction. So we've got the body and the handle. The place that I start is after the spit coat, is doing the back and the sides, developing the surface on the back and the sides, and basically leaving the top as it is with the spit coat. And there's a couple reasons for this. After the presentation, you're all welcome to come up and really look at this closely, and you'll see the top just has the spit coat on it, still pretty open, 4-wise. The back and the sides have probably three goes of application and sanding. So you'll see the difference in terms of how the surface is developed between just the spit coat and what's fairly close. I'm probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through the bodying sequence on the back and the neck on this. I think my final surface for this guitar, which I'm going to give to a friend of mine, is probably going to be not a polished surface, but I'll probably get it to the point where I could polish it, but then take some number 4 Liberon steel wool. Anybody use Liberon steel wool? You can get it from Rockler Company. It's a very refined steel wool, and I'll give it sort of a rubbed satin finish using the steel wool.
Is there any oil in that steel wool?
No. It's designed for finishing, basically. Yeah.
Do you ever start with pumice, or have you in the past?
No, I have in the past. I have in the past, and it's one of those traditional techniques that I've left behind, because I found it very unsatisfying to have this grit in this shellac as I was working it. Trying to mind where your grit was sitting, and it was like it was like fingers on a blackboard. It works. Don't get me wrong, it works, but I just didn't like it. I didn't enjoy. I much prefer the filling that I'm doing.
Sorry, what was that brand of steel wool?
Liberon, Liberon. It's English, I think. It's expensive. It's like $7.50 for like 4 little pads of it. But it breaks down very quick. It's very refined, breaks down very quickly. So it doesn't, but it puts a really beautiful matte sort of sheen on the surface. I've used it in restoration a lot, because a lot of the antique guitars that I restore using French polish, the old French polish takes on a really lovely sort of satiny look to it that's almost impossible to replicate with the new French polish. But it's the closest thing I found. It has enough tooth to just give you the right degree of satiny to kill that shine and blend it. So
When I was polishing high-grade barrels at the gun company, I used to take them down to a crocus cloth and then back them down with 4-ounce steel wool.
Right.
I'd take them shiny so I could make sure there were no flaws in the surface before I brought it back.
Well, the nice thing about a matte finish, of course, is that you don't see the surface flaws. A gloss finish shows every little
But that
thing.
gave me the chance to see if there were any there before I brought it back.
Right, exactly.
David, I'm sorry, what part of the, I'm sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
what part of the sequence was the steel wool used?
Well, this is I'm just jumping ahead to the very end,
Oh,
which is like the polishing sequence. So you could polish using these rubbing compounds that I described, or you could use like a steel wool if you wanted more of a matte
I thought it was
finish.
part of the wash.
This gentleman here.
Well, that's sort of the same question. I lost where the sequence.
Oh, all right, yeah, the steel wool, I jumped ahead. Steel wool
Number
is,
1 on the body and sequence.
Do
You
you
still
use
use
lubricant for the steel wool or just?
no, just clean.
Final question on the steel wool, just with the grain?
Yeah,
With the grain?
yeah, with the grain. Yeah, with the grain. Although if you're doing a neck, you're sort of, you know, you're going in every which way. But on the body where it's convenient to go with the grain, yeah, go with the grain.
How do you deal with the residual steel fiber?
Just wipe them off. It's not, you know, the Liberon really sort of crumbles, you know, in that sense. So you start out with a pad this big and you're left with a pad like a quarter of the size by the time you've really gone over the thing. All right, so I'm going to start bodying this. Basically what I'm going to thin this out. This is a little heavier than what I normally use, so I'm going to just add a little bit of, how are we doing on our time here? All right, so we got an hour. Good. While I'm doing this, you're welcome to shout out questions. So this is the basic beginning cut, thinned by maybe 40%, and I'm going to add a little bit of thinner to maybe thin it to 60%. So 60% alcohol and 40% shellac. Just take it down to a little thinner cut than I had before because I'm getting further along the process. As I said, both this neck and the back and sides have been done to about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through.
Would the spit coat be a full strength?
No, the spit coat is thinned out a bit too, yeah. Spit coat should be about a 50%, you know, yeah. Thin your spit coat so it flows.
If while you're doing the back and side, you get some of the mixture that kind of goes around the edge, is that cleanable? Could you?
I'll show you how I deal with that in my padding sequence. But this comes back to why I do the sequence that I was talking about. In other words, I've spit coated the whole thing. I developed the surface on the back and the sides. And the reason for this is that most of the guitars I make, of course, again, as I mentioned, have a spruce top and a light spruce top. If you do the opposite, if you do the top first, okay, you've got the top that, you know, pretty much completely bodied up, and it's a beautiful, even amber color over your spruce, and you're really happy with it. And you say, okay, now I'm going to do the back and sides. I mean, obviously, you need a dry surface to set this on. So that's why you do one or the other. You can either set it on the back or set it on the top. If you drip across that finished top, you're done. You have to start over again because, you know, if you work too wet and somehow you get a little shellac and it drips across the top, it'll dissolve it right across. So you'll end up with a big line right across your top. So what I usually do is develop the back and sides first, and then I do the top last. And that's to avoid having to redo it in case for some reason you drip on it. Lately, I've been getting so that, you know, that's a less likely proposition. So I might, you know, I might cheat and do it together a little bit here and there and just hang it up. But it's usually most convenient to have this totally dry without any, just have the spit coat on it, and it allows you to set it down. And the same thing with the neck. It sort of you kind of do that all at once. But on a guitar that has the neck and the body together, I'll do the back and sides as one. Back and sides and the heel along with it. Back and sides, heel, and then if it's convenient, I'll work up the peg head a little bit. And then most often I'll then do the top and the peg head. Of course, leaving the shaft of the neck so that I can handle it. And then the last thing to do is the shaft of the neck. So back and sides, top and peg head, neck that's the last. For a guitar that's all together, one like this separate, back and sides, and the neck can be done simultaneously, and then the top will be the last. Yes?
Do you see any problem with an attached guitar like you're talking about,
Right.
doing the whole thing and then hanging it between
Well,
the notes, or
no.
what do you run into?
You
with
can
that?
do whatever you can handle, but the problem is you still can't do the shaft of the neck, because you gotta
At a certain point, your hand is on it, and
yeah, you gotta manipulate it somehow, you know, and you'll see as I polish this, I'll be manipulating it all over the place. So you really need this portion unpolished so you can handle it. You can get away with doing the heel along with the sides and the back and ending off about at the, you know, where the heel transitions into the shaft of the neck. That's okay.
would it maybe be possible, and maybe this wouldn't be ideal, I guess that's why I'm asking, to leave a small portion and then once you hang it, just sort of that place where now your hand is off, you could finish that off?
Yeah, you could do that,
Or
but
then
I think you're gonna find that sooner or later you're gonna grab freshly polished surface.
Yeah.
It's gonna be like, you know. So, all right. So okay, we're gonna start doing some body in here. All right. So I'm gonna, you can see I'm gonna carefully measure the alcohol into there.
What alcohol do you like, David?
I'm just using the denatured alcohol.
Really?
Ethanol.
Denatured? You don't like Everclear or something like that?
I don't think I can get it in New York State.
Ah.
And
No, yes. I live in Brooklyn. I have a coworker gets it in Jersey.
yeah.
Although there's a Polish vodka that's it's even higher than Everclear.
Really?
You can buy it every liquor store in Albany has it. It's got like some Polish name on it.
What's that? Everclear?
Yeah, everything up in Albany, York.
All right.
It's like $25 a bottle.
$7.95 at Lowe's. All right, so this is pretty unsophisticated. I'm just mixing that up now. So the question was what to do with a pad as you get it out of there. Here's a cloth. I just have it folded. The table I work on at home is carpeted, so I take a little like square plywood or plexiglass and put it down and have a cloth on it so I've got a hard surface, something to press against. And I basically take this pad, which is kind of wet, and I squeeze it out against the edge, against the side of the jar. Get rid of as much, you know, really loose shellac as I can. Squeeze it out, get rid of the drippiness. But leave a little bit in there. You don't want to, so it's wet. You know, anybody who's adventuresome enough who wants to come up and I'll pad their hand, they can feel how wet this really is. Then what I'll do is just take it and form it a bit on this cloth, just to sort of blot it and flatten it. And if I need like a little bit of a sharp edge to get into a corner, I can form that edge a little bit, like so. Can you see that? Sort of a little bit of an edge. Okay. So this is now had 3 or 4, I think three applications of the same type I'm going to show you today. It's been sanded back, built up, and refined. And now I'm going to continue to do a similar application to what I've already done to bring this up. So this is, you see this is pretty matte. This is the sanded surface. So as I work this up, you're going to see it transform into basically a polished surface.
What's your time between? What's your time between?
Just overnight. Yeah, overnight. Apply, overnight, sand, do another application. You can pretty much go 24 hours. So now, starting with the back, you want to be careful. If you've got your pad charged a little bit, you know, they talk about, you know, sort of like landing on an air, you know, and like taking off again. Problem is, if you're not careful, you can sort of scrape out more polish than you want at the edge. So I've gotten into the thing of just doing one initial swipe to sort of get that edge, and then come in from that edge. Now, what you're seeing is that I'm using straight pulls, and I'm lapping once, basically. This is the key to being able to do this with no oil. If I went back over this, the pad would tend to want to stick. It's not quite so bad at this point because I'm applying over a dried surface, but if I was continuing to do this over a surface that I'd already applied a number of pulls, it would start to stick. So, okay, so you can see it's a little stripy, but that'll go away as I get. So immediately, whoever asked about the edge, I start with that edge. Catch that edge. In case there's a little accumulation, take it right off. So the application on the sides, basically, it's a little strategic. You know, you're thinking about, okay, how do I go about this in sequence and not like double over where I've been before? Basically, this is, you can get away with, you know, 45 seconds to a minute of lapping over without too much problem.
David, do you ever use oil?
No.
So you're using, so basically you're padding, not polishing them.
It depends on your definition. I think when you get to the last glazing part of this, you definitely, it's very much like the traditional French polish.
But you never use any oil?
No. So now for those of you who are working with the guitar with the heel already on it, at this point I'm just catching, let's pretend this is a real heel, just working around it, and then I sort of just go up and over like that. So working up the heel as I go.
That's how you apply all your coats, just like that?
Pretty much.
What if the heel builds up too much and, you know, the shaft doesn't get enough, you notice?
It's not, yeah, the heel is usually pretty open grain because it's, you know, because of the way it's cut. So it's not a problem. You know, you probably would have more of a problem not having it built up enough.
That's what I asked. It sucks it right in.
It
sucks the
It
slide
does,
right
yeah,
in.
it does.
You gotta go back over that, don't get it either.
So here we go again. At this point, you know, it's dried enough between what I just did. It's basically, it's dried quickly enough so that I can continue application here.
David, do you ever feel that the not using oil compromises the water resistance of the shellac finish?
Sort of to the contrary. I sort of, when I did use oil, I had more problems with the finish remaining soft and not necessarily not being waterproof, but just imprinting. You know,
well, which oils were you using back in the day then? Olive oils, or were you using linseed oils or mineral?
Boy, I don't remember what I used. It's so long ago.
Yes.
It was probably some form of linseed oil, is my guess.
Okay.
You know, boiled linseed oil.
Yeah.
But I don't, you know what? It's been so long, I don't even remember what I used.
Yeah.
Can you stick that pen up?
Walnut oil.
Yes, I will. So within about 45 seconds, that should be dry to the touch.
How do you know when to reload your pad?
When it starts to offer a bit more resistance than you want, like I'm feeling right now, I'm increasing my, it's still fine, but I'm increasing my pressure a little bit just to keep it moving. So it's a matter of the viscosity of the material that you're putting into it, how much material you're putting into it, and how much pressure you're applying. Now the thing is, as you're working on, you'll find that as you work sort of on the flat part of the pad, you're expressing more of the material out of it. So at that point you can start working maybe with the pad angled a little bit, so you're using the edges maybe that still are charged with a little bit more material.
So this is a really quicker way to body.
What can you do if you notice some dust flecks or something?
You can take a couple of swipes at them, and if you end up with a little bit of debris in there, just sand it out next time around.
How are you gonna load the pad?
I'll just dip it again and squeeze it and do exactly what you saw me do. See, again, this surface is pretty much dry to the touch because
This
the,
definitely cuts body in
huh?
time. This definitely cuts body in time.
Well, I mean, again, you're seeing the surface that's already I've already spent a fair amount of time bodying, sanding back, bodying, sanding back, bodying, sanding back. So I'm getting the benefit of all of that work that I did on the surfaces I'm going with it at this point. But can anybody hear the difference in sound? You hear that sort of scrapey sound? That pad's getting a little drier, but it's okay. It's okay. You just keep
See
it.
the pole.
Huh?
I can even see the pole.
Yeah, right.
It just doesn't slide.
But as long as you can keep it moving and it doesn't stick, you're okay.
So how many passes to a session would you do?
Oh boy, a lot. Maybe 15 to 20. I've never really counted. All right, so I'm going to set that aside just for a moment. We'll just do the neck similarly. I'll just recharge that ever so slightly, and really I'm just going to just touch it to the surface, just to load it, and then do a little blotting just to get a little bit more smoother, fresher stuff in there. Again, now the neck is pretty simple. I usually try to form a little bit of an edge on the pad to get into that corner with the nut, and then
Can I ask a question?
yeah.
Are you, on the body and sequence, are you doing number 3 at this moment in time? Is that where you're at?
Probably number 4th. I think the 4th. 3 or 4. Did I do 2 or 3? I can't quite remember. So just
So the
neck.
The very thin, was that the 60/40 or was that the number 1 thin?
What's that?
When you talk about number 1 is thin, then you do the fit, which was 50/50.
Right.
Number 1 was, I guess, 60/40. What was number 3 thin? Very thin.
I sort of stick with a 60-40 rough mix right through the sequence until the very end, when it becomes maybe 15 or 20 to 80. It's very thin at the end.
And you don't tape off the fingerboard or?
No. At the most, you might end up with a little accumulation along the edge, which you can see I usually just take a single edge razor blade or an X-Acto knife blade and scrape, clean it. The nice thing about French polish is you can really keep it where you want it. It's not like spraying where it's all over the place. It's very localized and very controllable. So basically I'm working this neck up, pretty much the same degree of wetness on the pad, just working it as in sequence, so I'm just lapping what I did previously, not going over it. And you can see this pad's a little drier, so you can see there's a little bit of stripiness on that, which will pretty much disappear once I've gone over it several times. The surface will build and sort of come together and be much more of a uniform, glossy surface.
And with the grain every time, you don't go with the grain one time
Well,
and
for
across
the
the
heel, of
other
course,
time.
I'm going across. Not always, yeah. You can go across the grain. It's okay if your strategic sequence of pulls, in order to not like overlap something 2 or 3 times more than once, causes you to go in that direction. It's fine.
I meant this way this time and this way next
Oh
time.
no,
this way
no.
this time.
I pretty much stick with the straight pulls.
All right.
With the grain. Because usually the longest axis is with the grain.
Yeah.
So there's no advantage in going short pulls. You might as well just, go, each pull can be as can be as long and as complete as
So how is that application is drying the touch really, really quickly, so you're going over.
right. So, and this is the key. This is the key to building the finish rather than just moving it around. A lot of people have talked to me over the years about, you know, if they're using figure-8 pulls or round, you know, circular pulls, they say, well, I kept going, but it seemed like I was taking as much off as I was putting on, and that's the thing. Unless, if you're not allowing it to set before you go over it again, you can just as easily pull the finish off as you can put it on. So here it's being applied, and it's pretty much set by the time I hit to go over it again. But because it dries fast enough, you can just continue. You can just really do it continuously. And, this is a little, yeah. This is still quite wet enough. But you can see I'm holding this fairly firmly, and there's a fair amount of pressure on the pad to keep it moving. And as I get this further bodied up, the pad resistance will increase. As soon as it starts to skid a little bit, then I either have to recharge the pad to get a little bit more liquid, or leave off. I tend to leave off because it's easier to sand back if you don't get too much. You know, the smoother you're able to keep it, the easier it all goes. And
What do you mean leave off?
let it dry overnight, and then sand. But I'm still quite a ways from getting so much on here that it's giving me enough resistance so that I want to let it set.
David, I know you said, but I want to make sure, the inside of the pad,
Right.
it's made out of what sort of material?
It's just a raw cotton material,
Okay.
unrefined cotton. Now, if I was patting a fairly thick, wet, amount on here, it would not dry in 45 seconds. It would continue. It would be sticky, and then you'd be running into trouble. As you repeat. See that? Right there, it caught a little bit and rolled out of my fingers. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
When you're padding,
I went a little too far over what I was just done. That was what
padding
happened.
in the depth of the cutaway, what do you do to keep from
I just,
seeing that spot?
yeah, I've done a little bit of this, as the cross the grain question, just trying to do it evenly. I've actually gone across the grain a little bit there too. It's a little bit awkward to do it like this, so there's nothing wrong with doing it that way.
Oftentimes in the waist that they get that problem where it wants to.
Yeah, you can do that. If you want to come up with a regimen where you're doing some side pulls and stuff, that's fine. It's just a matter of, it's sort of one of the things I've done a lot of is redoing classical guitars with the bridge on. And in that case, you're doing pulls like this. You're maybe starting with a pull like this, and then you've got a bridge here, so it's straight pulls up until you hit the edge of the bridge, edge of the wing, then one pull like this, and then behind the bridge, then one pull along the front end of the bridge, and working all the way up to the edge of the next wing, and then complete pulls.
And you would tape the bridge.
Now, it's easier just to sand and clean that bridge, because if you tape it, you can wick finish under it. You're going to end up, you don't know what you got there. So I just try to form the pad as cleanly to an edge as I can and work up to the edge. this is why I finish tops and then glue the bridge. But on
This
some,
this is very different. than doing
on
it.
restorations, sometimes on a classical guitar, you don't pull the bridge. The bridge is well glued, you just work around it.
And it is very different than doing furniture.
Yeah, and some people build their classicals, they like to, you know, get it strung up and play it and mess with the bracing and you know, have the bridge on, and then they deal with the finishing. I've done it both ways, but much prefer to do the French polish on the top in its entirety, and then mask off, remove the finish under the bridge, and then put the bridge on. So you get much cleaner results. But you can do it either way. Yes?
Have you considered or tried French polishing with royal lac?
Somebody was asking about royal lac, and my answer to that was I don't know anything about it, and the problem that I have with all of these proprietary finishes, I don't know what's in them, you know, and they won't tell you. And without knowing what's in it, I don't know if it's going to be compatible with other things that I'm doing or not. So it's one of the reasons I like just the very simple basic. I know what I've got here is shellac and alcohol, and that's it. There's nothing else that I have to be worried about here.
Where do you fill maple?
What's that?
What do you use for filling maple?
I don't fill maple. Doesn't need to be filled. That's one of the maple and woods like maple and cypress are great to French polish because you don't have to fill them, and they take less time because you're not trying to you know, get the finish built up and smooth and cut back where you're trying to fill the pores, you know. Yeah, I love French polishing maple and cypress. It's really, I don't know, what other woods don't need filling? Some of these odd woods. Brazilian rosewood is the worst. It's got pores like the Grand Canyon, as I'm sure most of you are aware. Indian rosewood's got lots of pores, but they tend to be smaller, so it's a little easier to deal with Indian rosewood.
When you do filling, I noticed you said you only use one coat.
Right.
I've got some of this backle coat that I use on guitar, and I think they recommend 3.
Well, there's a number of things you can use. Anybody remember Tom Bozzolo? Very good, very nice fellow, and very good guitar maker from, I guess he was from Connecticut originally, living in Maine. So yeah, I'm going to do this. I'll try this. Okay, that's good. He was advocating the use of Z-epoxy for filler. Because he said, you know, I'll fill the guitar with Z-epoxy. He said, then I can French polish it in a day. And indeed, with his guitars. And you see, I'm getting creative about how I'm handling this here. This is where this handle comes in useful. And indeed, you know, what he was doing though, but what he was really doing is he was doing such a complete fill with Z-epoxy. He was basically finishing the guitar in Z-epoxy and then like French polishing the surface, you know, just sort of French polishing it at the end. And after a lifetime of working with various kinds of, you know, polyurethanes and polyesters and epoxies in my work at the museum, I really didn't want to increase my body burden of that kind of stuff. Plus, I couldn't think of anything less appealing than doing this involving epoxy in this sort of finishing. These materials are really rather pleasant to work with, relatively speaking, and epoxy is just miserable stuff. So I never really got into that, but he had very good success using the Z-epoxy to fill the pores with, and it's probably a more complete fill than what I'm doing, but there are other drawbacks that just did not.
Some of shellac is addictive.
Shellac, you know, it's a natural product, and it's, the thing I like about the shellac is that there's really nothing that looks as nice on the wood as a nice shellac finish. It imparts a little bit of color to the wood. It really, you know, a really well done French polish finish is really a lovely finish. I think, and this gets a little bit into a little bit of philosophical attitude adjustment, perhaps, for you know, finishing guitars. Years ago, a number of years ago, I walked into Music Emporium in Boston, which is a great store and has great stuff. And, you know, there were guitars there by Martin and Larrivee and, you know, other manufacturers that were making, you know, Collings, making great guitars. And also guitars by a number of, you know, individual makers. And I looked at them sort of arrayed around the shop. But the thing that struck me is that the factory guitars, the individually made guitars, they all had exactly the same finish on them. They all had that lovely, glossy, very well-filled, perfect surface lacquer finish. So I couldn't really tell the difference between the factory-produced guitars and the handmade guitars because they all looked alike. And it made me want to sort of seek a little bit of a different aesthetic for what I was doing. Something that would not be, I think it's kind of ironic that in the years when I started making guitars, I made my first guitar in 1966, and in those years, the only really good guitars or guitars you ever saw were factory-made guitars, and we all spent 15 or 20 years aping the look of a factory guitar. The better you were, I mean, the more your guitar, as an individual maker, the more your guitar looked like it was built in a factory, sort of the better it was. You know, you got that fit and that finish just the way, you know, you're used to seeing that Martin guitar. And it was sort of what we all strove for.
Public perception.
Part of it is that, yeah. So some of this, one of the reasons that I decided to concentrate on classical guitars was that the public perception was a little bit different in terms of what was considered desirable. But I think I think that same perception can carry over. I've seen, you know, I don't see any reason why there wouldn't be a number of different kinds of instruments. I mean, I think, I'm not sure this is the right finish for a dreadnought that's going to get played in you know, at a sweaty, hot festival, you know, for a bluegrass band. But it could very well be the right finish for like a fingerstyle steel string player, or you know, certainly classical players are well familiar with French polish. And I make a lot of. Lately, I've made a few replicas of antique Martin guitars. I recently did a little copy of the Ditson 145 that's in the Martin Museum. And French polish is perfect for those guitars because they were all finished. A lot of them were finished in French polish, and even the slightly later ones that had a varnish finish. It's a very thin finish, so this looks right on that sort of guitar. So there's lots of places where I think this finish works and is appropriate. Yeah, Bill.
Have you ever known anybody who just say French polished the top and then did something else?
That is, yeah, that's fairly common. You know, people will use a varnish or lacquer for the back, sides, and neck, and French polish the top. It produces very good results, but to my mind, it sort of throws away whatever benefit you get by French polish by doing the lacquer or doing the varnish. You're into all the things that made me want a French polish. Okay. You know, but it works. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, and a lot of people. Classical makers will do that because they want what they consider to be better durability on, say, a varnish finish for back, sides, and neck, and want what the perceived advantage of a French polish finish on the top.
Plus, I just think to be able to have a really, really thin finish on the top.
Yeah, but you know, I think the idea of durability in terms of some finishes being more durable is a debatable one, because how many great old lacquer finishes have we seen that have chipped and literally exfoliated off the guitar in large, or checked or cracked or whatever, and they're hard to renew. An old guitar, I don't know how many of you deal with old guitars, an old guitar that's been French polished you can rebuild that French polish finish. If it's worn off, you can spot finish it, you can over polish it, you can do a lot with that you can't do with a lacquer finish. So, you know, over the life of an instrument, if you're going to consider the life of an instrument to be in the hundreds of years, what's really more durable? Something that you can renew, or something that you have to replace because it's sort of degraded to the point where I work on guitars that are 175 years old, and I recently restored an 1836 Juan Perfumo guitar. And, you know, I was able to easily, you know, restore the French polish finish with a very thinned out finish. You know, an ancient guitar, and without it looking like I did anything to it, you know, because you can do that with the French polish finish. Yeah.
What's your experience with the durability of the French polish finish on the neck?
On the neck?
It depends on the player and on the body.
Yeah. It does depend on that, but certainly you can wear through it just like you can wear through a lacquer finish. But you know, a couple of days of touching it up, cleaning it and touching it up renews it, so it's maintainable in that sense.
I mean more like it getting gummy or activating it.
I haven't had that problem with doing it in this mode with no oil. I mean, I think if you were to build up that finish thicker than it needed to be, and didn't let it dry completely, you might end up with that problem. But it has probably a lot to do with players, you know, skin oils and body chemistry, because, I mean, we've all seen lacquer finishes that people tend to dissolve with their hands. Yeah.
I had two questions. One, I don't know how familiar you are with True Oil, but
yeah, True Oil's
would
basically.
you say that is maintainable? Like
True Oil's tongue oil, right? All right. What is it? You know?
I thought it was half tongue oil.
Yeah, it's polymerized.
I think if I have Danish oil, tongue oil.
Well, yeah, some of these oils are made so they polymerize. I mean, boiled linseed oil is basically polymerizes. And this again is the problem with proprietaries. What is true oil? Well, we think it's this, but we don't really know. You know, probably you probably can recoat it. I'm guessing.
Because then you'd get the durability. You'd get the durability for the back and sides of the neck if you wanted that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you can
similarly easy to work and.
Recently, I built a guitar that I really thought should have a varnish finish. So I finished it in the Epiphanes varnish. I got the Epiphanes varnish, and I got the varnish, and I got the naphtha for washing it down, and I got the reducer, and I got the accelerator, and I got the brush and the thing to put the brush in, and it worked fine. It was lovely stuff, but boy, it was a complex system to get into. It was, before I was even halfway through, I was wishing I had just decided to French polish it, because the simplicity of this is just, you don't need much, and it produces the results that I want. So
I do true oil method similar to this.
Mm-hmm. Are you putting it on wetter than the pad that you felt?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's more of a wipe-on finish then.
Yeah, really.
What made you decide you wanted to varnish it instead of French polish?
It was a guitar that I made from parts that came from a guitar maker in New York named Manuk Papazian. And I inherited or bought some tops, some of his old tops that he passed away about 15, 20 years ago. And so it was basically built sort of as a homage to him because it was made with some of the parts that he had left behind. And all his guitars were varnished, so to have the right look for, I call it the Franken posse because it was sort of half me and half him. So that one I varnished because I thought it was the proper look.
I think there are recipes for true oil on the internet. I've talked to people who make it themselves, and it doesn't have a very long shelf life.
Yeah. Well, it's the reason too, you know, I mean, one of the first things you learn in woodworking is don't take all your linseed oil soaked rags and put them in a pile in the corner of your ramshackle wooden shop.
Yeah.
Because it'll end up burning. Yeah, because there's a chemical reaction that takes place. Shellac will polymerize over maybe 100 years, 75 years. A lot of the really early modern guitars that I work on, the finish won't. If you take alcohol, you won't dissolve the finish. The finish is no longer dissolvable in alcohol because I think they polymerize. Yes.
What's the definition of polymerize?
It's the molecules chemically bond and link with each other. So, any chemists here? So what is it? The OH linkage? Is that what hooks up with what?
Basically, what happens, the molecules bond together and form long chains.
Right.
And those chains become very, very stable and hard to break.
Right.
So what is the net result or difference in applicable to us?
Well, the difference is once those changes form, your normal solvent just won't break into this.
Right. So over a long period of time, a shellac finish may polymerize, and a fresh shellac finish. If you take if you have a problem with your finish and you're not happy with the way it's progressing, just take a rag and soak it in alcohol and rub it right off. It'll just come away completely with an alcohol-soaked rag. You can't do that with a really old guitar that has a French polish finish because it's polymerized and it won't dissolve that way. Yes?
So how long do you let a new finish cure before you send it to the buyer?
It usually takes me 4 or 5 weeks to do a French polish finish, and then and that's letting it sit fairly generously during periods that I've been working on it, and then maybe a few weeks longer. So probably about 8 weeks. I feel like it dries hard very soon. There's no residual. If you want to inspect these tomorrow morning in phase 2, these will be nice and dry. There's no residual softness or gumminess or anything because each application is very thin. I wouldn't even attempt to measure it, but it's the thickness of what's on there in total is probably less on the order of maybe, I'm sure it's not even, it's probably maybe somewhere between 1 and 2/1000ths of an inch. It's way thinner than let's say a 6 mil lacquer finish. Lacquer finish that's 6 to 8 mils, which is.
So you'd avoid putting that in a case for about 8 weeks.
I have a cabinet that I leave these things sitting in.
You control the humidity, temperature?
Yeah, I could. Yeah, but no more so than but not necessarily because of the French polishing. I control the temperature and humidity just on general principles in my work area for construction and just storage of other people's OP instruments, other people's, which I'm always very concerned about not returning to them in something less condition than they left them. So now, do you see that little bit of, I'm getting enough on there now so that I wet the pad a little bit to facilitate its movement, but I'm being a little bit more deliberate and forceful about keeping it moving, because now that I've built up finish, there's more resistance to its free movement across that surface. And
I didn't know when to quit, let it dry, come back to it the next day.
if I have a little problem, like with a piece of debris or something, and I really feel like or if it starts to feel like I'm getting more unevenness on the surface that I'm happy with, I'll leave off. There's one sort of philosophical thing to keep in mind in doing this, and that's the fact that you've got sort of have a mindset of, okay, I'm going to put on even coats, and I'm going to sand them off evenly, and then I'm going to put on more even coats, and I'm going to sand them off nice and even, and I'm going to build up this nice, even surface on this instrument, and when I'm done, it's going to look great. But in fact, the more you work it over, the more you apply your finish, and the more you sand back, the more uneven it gets. So if you go too far with it, and that unevenness is constantly working against you, what you can end up with is when you start having dark areas, and then you're sanding through in certain areas. So one of the important things is to know when the hell to leave off, because you get to the point where you've got an optimal result, and the more you work it over is not going to make it better. So you have to keep that in mind as you go through this, is to try to be aware of achieving that optimal result, and the fact that the more you work it over, the more uneven everything's going to get. Just because you're human, you don't have that sort of fine control over what you're doing.
Maybe you already said this, but how many coats before you sand?
Well, you've seen how many applications I put on this today. This is sort of typical of what I would do and then leave off and then sand. So tomorrow morning, first thing I'm going to do is we're going to sand this back.
Oh, so every day after every dry?
Yeah, right. So I'm going to sand this back, and I'm going to do more of a glazing. Like, this is just pretty much straight bodying that I'm illustrating right now. I'm going to be doing what I would call glazing tomorrow, which is, even if this is not completely at the point where I would normally glaze it, it's getting pretty close, so it doesn't make that much difference. But I'm going to glaze it, which is with a much drier pad and a much more squeezed out pad. So it's putting on that final polished surface, as opposed to, the bodying that I'm doing now, which is designed to, as smoothly and evenly as one can, being a human being, build up the surface. So you're all welcome to come up and take a close look at this, because I think you get a better idea of what's going on. Yeah, I would